Welcome to the Better Not Bitter podcast, where we utilize the vehicle of storytelling for kingdom impact and outreach, inviting you, the listener, to join us on this journey of becoming better and not bitter. I'm your host, Mayia Warren, artist, philanthropreneur, and advocate. One thing I know I want to be, I want to be better. I don't want to be bitter. Hey, y'all. Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Mayia Warren, and I'm excited to share this experience with you all as I interview a very new guest to the platform. His name is Dr. Lamar Hardwick, also known as the Autism Pastor, but I won't talk too much about him. I'll let him introduce himself. So how are you doing, Dr. Lamar Hardwick?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for asking. It's, as you know, every day has its own unique set of challenges and experiences, but today I feel pretty good, actually.
I'm glad to hear that. Could you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Yeah, so I'll try to give you the abbreviated version. I grew up in a military family. I have 3 siblings, an older sister, 2 brothers. And so I share that because people always ask me where I'm from. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell them, well, we kind of moved every 3 years, so it's hard to say where I'm from. But I was born in Texas. Don't remember much of it because we moved to Georgia, spent a couple of years there, and then we shipped off to Germany, where I lived, or we lived for about 3 or 4 years, and then came back to the States, back to Texas, a different part. And that's where I finished up school, and my dad ended up retiring in El Paso, Texas. So he served in the military for, I guess, 25 plus years. Wow. So all of my nuclear family is still in Texas. I currently live in the Atlanta area in Georgia, in a place called Noonan, Georgia, which is about 20, 30 minutes south of the Atlanta airport. So we're on the South Metro side of Atlanta. I am married. I've been married to my wife, Isabella, for 23 years, but we started dating when we were 18. So I don't really know anybody else.
That's beautiful.
As a relationship. My wife is from Malawi in Africa. She grew up there, but she came to the States at 16 to start college. So she's really super smart. Started college when she was 16. And we both graduated from Concordia University in Wisconsin. And that's where we met. We have 3 children, all boys. One's in college. He's about to be 19. And our middle son is 15. And our youngest son just turned 11. So we have a college freshman, a high school freshman, and then a soon-to-be middle schooler. So wow. we kind of spread it out. I don't know why we did that. So I'm like the oldest parent that has like a middle schooler. All these other parents are way younger than us. But most people know me online as the Autism Pastor, as you said in the introduction. And I like to tell people that I actually didn't come up with that. I myself was diagnosed late. So I was diagnosed at age 36 back in 2014. So about 10 years ago. Although I tell people around age 7 or 8, I knew that there were significant differences between me and my peers. Like I didn't understand a lot of things. I faked a lot of things. I pretended to understand things that the other kids were interested in and what they were talking about. I later found out that that's because part of autism is the struggle to understand unspoken language, like body language, facial expressions, voice intonation, otherwise known as social cues, still things that I struggle with, but I didn't have a language or a way to talk about what that struggle was. And then, you know, when you're a kid, you think everybody experiences the world the way you do. So while everybody else thought I was strange, I thought they were strange because they they didn't experience the world the way that I did. So I'm like, there's nothing wrong with me. What's wrong with you?
Mm-hmm.
But I ended up um, getting diagnosed. That's a whole other story. That sort of, I felt like my back was against the wall at a point in time in my life in ministry. So I ended up going to seek some help when I was diagnosed with autism. But at that time, I had already done my research for about a year, and I was pretty sure I knew what was going on.
Mm.
And so
Wow.
it didn't come as a surprise to me because I had already sort of figured out what my challenges were, why I was having those challenges, even in communicating with my wife. And so by the time I got the diagnosis, it was just confirmation of something that I already had known from my own research.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the last thing I'll say that might be important for people to know is I am a pastor. I should say I'm a recently retired pastor. Those who follow me online know that for the last 4 years, I've been dealing with cancer. I was diagnosed in 2020, had about a year of remission, then it came back and it eventually spread. So now I am battling stage 4 cancer, and that requires me to do chemo every other week. And it began to be sort of challenging to hold my position as the lead pastor at my former church. So I stepped down and retired at the end of last year.
Mm-hmm.
Although I'm still a part of that church, still attend, they still keep me in the preaching rotation. So I preach about once a month. It just got to the point where leading it was something that was very challenging. And I felt like they needed somebody who could dedicate themselves full time. So I pastored that church for 5 years. And then before that, I pastored another church for 9, almost 10 years. And then before that, I planted a church back in 2004, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Can't remember. I'm getting old, but I did plant a church. So I've been pastoring over 20 years.
Wow.
And I did my master's at Emory, did a doctorate at Liberty. I was currently doing another doctorate, a PhD, but I'm on medical leave right now. So I put that on pause to take care of some health issues. But I think that's a good picture of who I am. The autism pastor label actually came from a parent who told me at one point when I was early on in uh, post diagnosis, I was writing and blogging and actually meeting with a lot of parents. Before Zoom was cool, I was doing Skype with parents and their children, just kind of mentoring them, walking them through things. And I don't know where this woman is today, but she sent me a message and said, you're like the pastor for the autism community
Wow.
because a lot of us don't feel welcome at church or we've had bad experiences. And so
Mm-hmm.
I was doing a lot of praying with people, counseling people, just making relationships with people. So when she said pastor for the autism community, I said autism pastor. And so I actually changed all my social media labels to that because it made it easier for people to find me. So
Mm-hmm.
that's where that moniker came from. And it just kind of stuck for over the last 10 years.
That's awesome. And as you were sharing the succinct, version of what you do and who you get to connect with in terms of being a pastor and an advocate, it made me think about my own journey.
Mm-hmm.
How with albinism, for those who are listening, I have no pigment in my eyes, hair, and skin, so that's where my vision impairment comes from.
Mm-hmm.
So being a black woman with no pigment, then also um, having some genetic chronic conditions that didn't get diagnosed until I think it was around 2021.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I can relate to the theme of like, oh, that was confirmation, right? Um, in a lot of areas. And I hear in your story that you shared so far, it sounds like even in your cancer journey, even with autism, God is continuing to use you and your experience, even as you're navigating those things. Um, could you talk about maybe like the impact of your faith on your current journey with cancer and as you continue to advocate and do disability advocacy?
Good question. Yeah, faith. I tell people that my faith, I it's one of those kids. I should also say that my dad wasn't just a military guy; he was also in ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So he was a minister, still is. Both my parents are still living. Um, and even when we lived in Germany, he pastored the church that we attended for those 3 or 4 years. It was a very transient church because most of the people were military. So you'd get a whole new crop of people coming in every year. And, after our 3 or 4 years stint, we were shipped out. But so I grew up in that environment. And I tell people two things really shaped my life and my faith. And that was my father was uh, in the military and he was also a minister. And so I say that to say that very early on, despite some of the challenges that I knew I had but couldn't identify, I knew that there was something about life that required you to surrender to something bigger than yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so, being in the military, obviously, you're not really in charge. You're not even in charge of where you live. So we move a lot because we had to surrender to a mission that was bigger than ourselves. My older sister and I joke that we still get an itch to move every 3 years because we never stayed anywhere. So I have to really control my urge to move
Mm-hmm.
because that was just a part of how we grew up. But then also my father being a minister shaped me understanding surrender to something bigger than myself. So I didn't always know what that was, even though I grew up in the church.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there was a time that I didn't believe in Jesus. Like I just was not a person who had a lot of questions about that. I had a lot of questions about other things, but it was kind of something that my house was really saturated with. So,
Mm-hmm.
by the time I got older and made a heart connection to it, it was not something that was foreign to me. It was more like my diagnosis. I was making a confirmation of things that I had already sort of internally believed. And
Mm-hmm.
I was ready to kind of publicly stand on that. And that came in my teenage years. Um, and then I had what I call my Jonah experience in college. I actually went to college to play football. So I went to Concordia University, Wisconsin, which is a small school. Went there to play football. But my freshman year, I got into a serious car accident. Uh, and at the time, one of the people who was in that car was my then girlfriend, my now wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I was at a stage where I knew all the things about Jesus. I definitely believed in him, but I was having a hard time living that out in a college environment.
Uh-huh.
I won't go into detail. Everybody knows what that means. uh, but I remember that car accident. God saying to me, everybody in this car is gonna be impacted by your running away from me. Right. And
Mm.
so that's why I call it my Jonah story. If you remember the story of Jonah,
Mm-hmm.
he jumped on the ship and everything was fine until he got on board. All of a sudden there were storms and sailors are trying to figure out what's going on. And Jonah finally confessed, I'm the reason why you're going through all this. And so it's kind of a similar situation. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that was God's way of getting my attention because I wasn't really caring about my own life, but I
Mm.
did care a lot about the people that was in the car with me.
Wow.
And so while I don't think God would have intentionally allowed harm to come to them, I think he was using that experience to teach me a lesson like, look, I know you don't really care a lot about your own life, but I do know that you really care about others. And I want you to see how your life can impact other people. So whether you're running to me or running away from me, it's going to impact everyone around you. And I think that was the first time at age probably 18 or 19 where I sensed a call
Mm-hmm.
when I realized, wow, if I'm running away from God and stuff happens to people that I care about, what would happen if I actually ran towards God?
Mm.
How would that impact the people around me? And so it took several years before I accepted like a formal call to ordain ministry, but that was one of the first times where uh, my faith
Mm-hmm.
started to shape my life in ways that were significant, and that just carried all the way into being diagnosed,
Wow.
both with autism and cancer is like, okay, here's two experiences that I don't think God caused,
Mm-hmm.
but I do think God has a way to influence those situations and influence my life for the better. And definitely, always going back to my Jonah story, I remember, well, these are times where I need to run to God because I think what I'm going through can impact people in a positive way. And so I think that's what God has been able to do and how he's been able to use me is to use all the situations I've gone through, whether it's being diagnosed as an adult or being diagnosed with cancer twice. Um, he's used it to be able to impact people's lives in a positive way as long as I keep running in his direction.
Wow. And as you were talking, right, I heard some kind of like reoccurring words that you use, and one of them was impact.
Hmm.
And the other one was care. And I think even in my own experience, the more God unravels me in terms of me embracing each part of my story, things that I've been through,
Hmm.
um, the more I see him using that for impact. And I halfway joke, but I'm serious at the same time. I feel like there's nothing in my life that God doesn't use.
Hmm.
Like I can go through something, in the next 20 minutes, and God would allow that to be a point of conversation, either in the form of advocacy or just, discipleship or, walking alongside people.
Hmm.
And, I remember being younger and it used to kind of irritate me because I felt like other people could just go through stuff and they didn't have to share, or, the Holy Spirit wasn't prompting them to tell their business, quote unquote.
Hmm. Right.
um, and I was like, God, why? I feel like you always want me to be the one to step out to say something. And like even much like, that parent gave you the title of autism pastor.
Hmm.
Um, like God called me to advocacy when I still hated people.
Hmm.
um, and I didn't know I was an advocate until he used the social worker who had shut me down later in the semester when I was trying to self advocate. And he used that person to call out the fact that what I was doing was advocacy. And it felt backwards. It was like you just ridiculed me for being an advocate, and now you're calling me the thing that you anyway. So
Yeah.
for me, it was God calling me to that, and then over time changing my heart to realize that I actually loved people. I was just afraid of getting hurt because I was navigating a
Mm.
lot of
Yeah.
childhood trauma, and nobody told me the condition I had and why I had no pigment and why I was visually impaired. Nobody explained these things to me. So my
Hmm.
answer was to just, well, if people close to me are hurting me, let me just shut down and be hardened towards people to protect myself. Because,
Right.
what I didn't realize was that God gave me a capacity to love like he gives everyone. And I was
Hmm.
trying to protect my heart. And just over time, God continued to soften my heart towards his will and his way for my life, to the point where he literally uses everything that I go through and that I've gone through. Um, and I know as an advocate, particularly as a Christian in advocacy spaces, right?
Hmm.
So you and I both do speaking engagements at different conferences, and not all of the conferences that you speak at related to disability are kingdom oriented. Sometimes they're
Hmm.
just like for different organizations or nonprofits. Could you talk about what it's like for you being a Christian, a pastor, being able to be authentic even in those spaces, and kind of the impact that God has allowed you to have?
Yeah. Good question. Um, and that's a good question because I do get a lot of invitations to speak and to share at a lot of what people would consider quote unquote secular organizations.
Hmm.
Um, Side note, like I tend to not try to divide things that way because I think God
Yeah.
is in everything.
Yep.
But when I am in those spaces, I have actually found a pretty good sweet spot to where actually the talks that I give at, if it's a disability ministry conference or something that I've written in a book or an article, I use actually the same material, but what I do is I actually follow Jesus's model. I tell a lot of stories,
Mm-hmm.
parables, um, things that point to God in ways that have been significant in my life, my advocacy, and even pointing those organizations towards, um, justice and those types of things that God stands for.
Mm-hmm.
And I found early on it was really hard to do that
Mm-hmm.
because I was using a lot of quote unquote Christianese, and people would not be offended by it, but sometimes they wouldn't even understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really thought about, let me back up and see, what made Jesus's ministry so significant, other than we know him going to the cross, but the crowds flocked to him because he was a great storyteller, right?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Jesus was so good at telling stories. We think a lot of those stories, like we forget that those things never happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we think that there really was a good Samaritan. It was just a story, right? But that's how
Mm-hmm.
good he is. We think there was really a prodigal son, but it was just a story. But we even thousands of years later, we identify with those characters because he was so good at using them to teach us what God was like. And I found that oftentimes Jesus would use people and things that we don't like to show us what God is like. So you think
Mm-hmm.
about stories like the unjust judge, like we focus on the widow, but he says, learn a lesson from the judge, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's nothing like God, but the point is that God is the opposite of that guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I've been able to do over time, and this wasn't easy, was to learn how to take the same material that I would share at a Christian conference and package it in stories, whether they're stories about my life, whether they're even remixes of parables that Jesus taught. Like I've used the parable of the wheat, the
Yep.
parable of the sower, the parable of the wheat and weeds. I've actually used those in talks for organizations that are not Christian.
Yeah.
I kind of remix them, right? But there's stories that I just basically ripped straight from Jesus's mouth. So I've learned how to navigate those spaces by still being authentic to who I am. They know who they're contracting to speak, right?
Mm-hmm.
They know my bio, but they also know I'm going to bring them some solid information. But
Yep.
all of that is coming from a place of being shaped by my faith.
Yep.
Everything that I share, whether it's in Christian circles or quote unquote non Christian circles, everything that I share about advocacy, I just did a talk to a biotech company. I know nothing about that, but they wanted me to talk about ableism in the workplace and how they
Yep.
can do better. And so I talked about a lot of the same things I talk about in my books. I just packaged it in a way that helped them to understand what it means to be just and do things equitably and treat people the way that God would have us treat them. So I've been able to. It took me a couple years to figure it out,
Mm-hmm.
but I've been able to take the same material. So I don't really change the material a lot.
Yeah.
I did just deliver it based on the context of the people who are contracting me to speak to them, and it seemed to work. Like I get very good ratings, especially when I tell the stories,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I feel like I am still making a kingdom impact because I am injecting principles that are straight from my faith into
Yeah.
organizations that may not be faith based. So that part has been fun trying to figure it out. It took me about 2 or 3 years to figure out how to do that.
Yeah. I think that's so awesome in a lot of ways. And the reason I asked you that question is because whenever I encounter other Christians and I tell them what my calling is and what I get to do, they're always like, "Well, how do you as a Christian like be in those spaces?"
Hmm.
And it tickles me because and I'm so thankful to have a mentor and a father figure um who's been where I am now in
Hmm.
terms of, learning the ins and out of contracting and consulting and speaking. And so it helps to have, that discipleship. And even one thing he encouraged me to do was not compartmentalize myself.
Hmm.
Um, and like if it's a disability conference, only mention disability because, your faith impacts everything that you do. It's the paradigm, the lens through which you see the world. And if they're asking me about me and they want me, you can't have me without Jesus, because
Mm,
he's part of
right.
my story. And the reason why I can even a lot of times communicate because I have a lot of challenges going on physically. And
Mm,
so, like you, like I don't change the content or the messaging. I make it applicable to the context of the
mm,
space that I'm in. And even, as you know, you get vetted as a speaker. Like they have to look at your social media, they look at your books, your literatures,
mm,
everything that you put out. And so I consider it, even when I get opportunities from organizations that aren't explicitly Christian or faith based, I consider it like, again, another opportunity God is providing, because there's
mm,
something within that context that they saw that they thought might be beneficial or impactful for their audience or the people that I'm speaking to. And so it's just been, I've been an advocate for going on 13 years.
mm,
And just to see what God has continued to do, um, through my story, especially the parts that I was ashamed of,
yeah.
um, or carried a lot of trauma with. Like God is allowing those things either through music or speaking to be a tool, right? Um, and in you kind of sharing your answer to that last question, you mentioned how different entities may pull from your literature.
Mm,
And for those who don't know, Dr. Lamar Hardwick is an author with multiple books. And that's actually how I found out about you, because I was on Amazon and I was like, I want to find some disability books,
mm,
particularly like in the scope of the Christian faith, because I hadn't really seen any. Um, and then I found, I forget the title all the way, but it was the book you wrote about ableism in the church.
mm,
Um, and I just started reading, and I was like, this is in approachable language. It's very straightforward. It is what it is, and you sharing your story. And through that, it made me think about uh, maybe some of the not so positive experiences I've had with other Christians in
mm,
relation to my diagnoses.
mm,
And it made me think about how God, even in those moments, he would challenge me. Yeah, you can be upset, frustrated, but do something with that passion and create a solution.
mm.
And so in reading that book, I saw your heart for people, right? Even in what you experienced. Could you talk about what inspired you to write the book? Tell people where they can find it.
Yeah. So, um, as you said, there's multiple books. You can find them really anywhere
Mm-hmm.
books are sold. The two most recent and two most popular are Disability in the Church, A Vision for uh, Diversity and Inclusion. That was released in 2021. And then the most recent one is How Ableism Fuels Racism, which is a book that actually just released in February. And so you can get on Amazon, anywhere you purchase books, or you can go to uh, Brazos Press or Baker Books, which is the publisher, and you can get it there. That most recent book is one that was challenging. I talk about ableism,
Mm-hmm.
um, but honestly, it stemmed from some work I was doing in my PhD program. Like I was doing a lot of work, so a lot of those early chapters were actually papers that I wrote for professors. And I was kind of testing it out because I was doing a lot of research trying to figure out, you know, there's a lot of things that are happening in our society and uh, regarding race, especially after 2020.
Mm-hmm.
That summer, we all know the things that are happening, like with George Floyd and a lot of protests. And so a lot of churches and a lot of Christians were becoming more open to having that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but also being somebody, a black man who's also disabled, I thought, you know what, there's something a little bit deeper here that's going on that I think we need to deal with in the history of our country. And that is really two things. One, the Christian faith or the church, the big C, has had a lot of influence on that. But then also that it wasn't just race that propped up racial segregation and racial slavery. It was actually, when you look at some historical documents, it was that they were using disability as a way to discriminate against Black bodies by
Mm-hmm.
saying um, these enslaved Africans were inherently disabled, and that's why they're
Mm-hmm.
inferior. So it wasn't just the color of their skin; it was something that was attached to the color of their skin. And in
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the language, they didn't necessarily use all the time disability, even though it started to surface more like in the 1700s and 1800s. But early on, it was basically they're mentally, spiritually, emotionally inferior, and they don't have the capacity to care for themselves, so they needed supervision. And that positioned a lot of early Puritan um, ideology to shape it as Christian charity. And so
Mm-hmm.
a lot of was the undergirding of a lot of things that happened in this country was there was never an ethos of Christian equality. It was
Mm-hmm.
always Christian charity. Well, if that happens, you end up having one side that's always looked at as inferior. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's really where it came from. So I started doing a lot of research. And once I turned in a couple of papers for these two classes and I was getting good grades on them, and the writing center was saying, these are very good papers, I thought, you know what, I'm going to turn this into a book.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because by that time I had already had maybe half a book just from research papers. Um,
Wow.
but when I you talk about having approachable language, when I turned it into the publisher who was wanting to sign me to a contract, they were like, "This is way too academic." So I was like, "Yeah," because they were PhD program papers. So I actually had to go
Mm-hmm.
back and do a lot of rewriting to make it accessible because a lot of the language is very academic, and
Mm-hmm.
it was a trade book, not academic book. So,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it was just sort of seeing how my research stood up to the test of professors looking at it. And once I knew I was onto something, I said, you know what, I want to write about this further. And then I just, put parts of my story in there to kind of make it personal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it was a challenging book to write because I knew I was going to get a lot of pushback on some things, but at the same time, I knew that my research was solid because I had, qualified, educated people telling me that these were good, solid research papers that I was writing. So I knew, you can't argue with history. So here we go. It might get some pushback, but so it was a project that I today to this day I'm proud of,
Yeah.
um, and hopefully people get their hands on it and read it. And it was also to help people to understand. We had that much. I think I say towards the end that ableism is evil, but it's not eternal.
Mm-hmm.
And so if the church can have that much influence uh, in a wrong way, imagine if we start to understand the history and change things and advocate in ways that communicate that we serve a God of justice. What could our impact be on society? So really, that
Amen.
was the point of writing the book, is to help us to see we do have influence,
Yeah.
and if we use it right, we can undo a lot of the things that have been done
Yeah.
in this country.
Yeah. And one I appreciate as someone who's been over the past years just getting diving more deeply into Black disability history
Hmm.
specifically, which I didn't know was a thing. And then I kind of stumbled upon it. And the reason I say stumbled upon it, because I'm sure you found that you kind of have to dig a lot more intentionally
Hmm.
to find these resources than you would for a lot of other reasons.
Right.
And even finding out how individuals like take Harriet Tubman, for example, we hear about how she essentially was quote unquote Moses for
Hmm.
African American slaves, helping them navigate the road to freedom. But
Hmm.
what's often left out of her story is the fact that she had epilepsy,
Hmm. Yep.
TBI,
Yeah.
and the list goes on, all these conditions. And I think we've gotten to a state society where we hypocritically tout the phrase representation matters
Hmm.
because we choose that phrase on things that um, actually don't have as much merit as we think it does.
Mm-hmm.
But I think representation in terms of history, like not hiding the characteristics of the people that we deem so worthy of, attention, like not hiding all of that, I think that matters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one finding out that Harriet Tubman, um, had all those conditions. I was like, oh, so she got a lot of stuff going on like I did, like I do. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I remember the first time seeing, someone in Black history in the civil rights movement that had albinism, and he was locking arms with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it's a historical photo that's everywhere. And all
Mm-hmm.
this time, I thought it was just, one of our Caucasian brothers and sisters, locking arms. And I was like, oh wait, no, this man actually was a pastor in Charlotte, North Carolina, who had albinism and was a part of the movement. So to see
Mm-hmm.
that kind of firm, it kind of embedded this impression on me like, oh, well, if during that climate, this person stepped outside of himself to kind of align with the mission of not just racial equality, but trying to bring about a healthier perspective of ethnic diversity. Um, who am I to tell myself that I'm disqualified from having an
Mm-hmm.
impact, right?
Right.
And so in hearing about your process with your books, it's encouraging, right? Because I know I have several friends who navigate a myriad of disabilities and conditions. And one thing I found that we all share is the ability to disqualify ourselves. Now, disability or not, everybody has something that makes you feel like, oh, I'm not good enough, or oh, that
Mm-hmm.
God wouldn't call me to do that. But I think stories like yours are impactful because it shows that God can help you navigate being built different, as I like
Mm-hmm.
to call it, uniquely created on purpose. And even though the outcome, looks the same, the journey to getting towards the outcome is different for everybody as
Mm-hmm.
we allow him to write our stories. Thank you for listening to the Better Not Bitter podcast. If you were impacted or engaged by the content in today's episode, consider subscribing to the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. For more information about this presentation, your host or guest, head on over to mayawarren.org/podcast. That's MAYIAWARREN.org/podcast. Lastly, if you're interested in accessing Maya's music, the music in the intro or in this end card, please search MAYIA on the streaming platform of your choice or head on over to the website.